Good morning. May I kindly ask?
Nëse kam mundësi të uleni në vendet e juaja, ju lutem. Faleminderit. Jam I sigurt që ka biseda të ndryshme që janë duke ndodhur dhe më falni që do t'u ndërpres, por do të doja që të fillonim në kohë, për shkak se ka një debat shumë interesant që do të na përcjell. Mirëmëngjes edhe një herë. Zonjusha Gjergjevska, zonjusha Tranchevska, I nderuar ambasador I Gjerë, I nderuar Rosana Toxhak, I nderuar zotri Artur Erker, zotri John, I nderuar miqtë dhe mikesha, kolega nga vendet të ndryshme, këtu edhe ju që jeni online që na ndiqni sot. Për ju që nuk më njihni, unë jam Afrodita Shala dhe të doja t'ju uroj mirëseardhjen në emër të UNFPA-s në forumin rajonal që quhet Virtualiteti është I vërtet, forcimi I kornizave legjislative në mbështetje të autonomisë trupore. Siç e kemi kuptuar, jeta jonë është transformuar nga qasja në teknologji dhe në internet.
Of course. However, we have also witnessed how these have created spaces of violence against women and girls. Today, we're here to start our conversation with the basic principle. Digital violence against women and girls is violence. As all forms of violence, it has eroded gender inequality and discrimination against women and girls. It has a real impact on women and girls' lives, affecting their health, well-being, and limiting their choices and opportunities. In response, the United Nations Population Fund is reflecting on how to address these forms of violence, and as part of our efforts, we're spearheading the Body Right campaign, a global call to action to disrupt violence against women and girls in virtual space. This forum is the first of its kind, and with our esteemed speakers from the Balkan region and beyond, we will reflect on the situation and think about how our legal frameworks can be adapted and improved to respond. Together, we will strengthen regional partnerships through crafting consistent and effective legal measures and raising awareness to combat digital violence and gender-based violence in general. Before we delve deeper into the conversation, I would like to invite our two distinguished speakers, Ms. Georgievska and Mr. Erken, to give the welcoming address and open this forum. It is my great honor and always a pleasure to invite our great supporter, Ms. Georgievska, to give opening remarks. Ms. Georgievska, the floor is yours.
Добър ден! Почитувани представници на Фондът за население на Обединените нации, почитувана министърка Тренчевска и партнери от регионът, почитувани присутни. На почетокот би сакала да се заблагодарам за поканата, да бидам дел от излагачите на денешниот регион.
Në këtë forumin rajonal, aktiviteti profilit të lartë që trajton temën thelbësore, siç është autonomia trupore në kontekst të dhunës në internet. Shprehur si dhonë, si shqetësim, diskriminim, dhonë në rrjetet sociale në bazë sociale, orientim seksual, identitet gjinor në përkatësi të grupit marginalizuar, dhuna në internet bëhet gjithnjë një sfidë më e madhe që është bëhet e patjetërsueshme që të flasim hapur dhe së bashku të punojmë
work on identifying sustainable solutions to tackle it. Both women and girls, as well as marginalized groups, are often target of digital violence. According to the UNFPA data, almost 85% of women globally have stated that they have witnessed violence, and almost 40% stated that they have been victims of digital violence. Having in mind these concerns, we need to reflect on which are our achievements, but also to set goals in terms of what can be done to tackle digital violence. In this context, such forums where we can discuss the experiences in the region, but also to learn from each other and assist each other, are actually an excellent mechanism that will help the development of effective solutions. In my view, each of us, by using the available tools, should provide support to this body right campaign. The aim of this campaign is to take action against violence against women and girls online. Solidarity is important as a mechanism to strengthen public awareness and to support victims, that they know that they are not alone, but also to encourage them to seek justice for any harms that were inflicted to them. Our body rights, even in the digital space, should be legally protected. We have witnessed cases where various photos and video materials have been abused or exploited for various kinds of violence. And when the victim tries to seek justice through the institutions, usually that justice is very slow. Faced with such challenges, one can understand that many girls and women would not take legal action in order to protect their rights. That is, their body rights online. As part of this regional forum, we will hear experiences from various experts, but also decision makers from the region in terms of the online violence and which are the available tools to the victims, as well as the measures that need to be taken in order to enhance the protection of survivors. Oftentimes, we speak about using internet as something which can be of major good for all of us, which can help us improve public services, but also the public outreach. The more the internet is available, the more the use by the citizens, and actually this prevents them also to recognize fake information, but also enables them to publish some of the online contents, and they use the social media as a virtual reality where violence is also realistic. Just like we put efforts to provide citizens with bigger access to internet, we also need to work on bigger education about violence. And also to provide legal safeguards for the survivors of digital violence. We have to welcome the fact that according to the law on prevention and protection of violence against women and domestic violence, enacted in 2020, for the first time, sexual online harassment has been defined. Other efforts have been taken to adopt other safeguards to protect the survivors of digital violence. Gender-based violence on internet must be treated as part of the range of gender-based violences. Just like we speak about domestic, partner, sexual, physical, emotional violence, or economic violence, we have to be vocal about digital violence, which can also include components of other types of gender-based violence. Institutional and legal mechanisms to protect citizens against digital violence, as well as sanctioning of citizens, are not sufficiently developed in many countries, including our country. So it is clear that the solutions have been recently adopted, because this is quite a new phenomenon and this is a complex issue which requires efficient legal mechanisms for sanctioning of digital violence. And I do hope that this will give rise to many dilemmas, but also this will require many novelties in the investigative but also judicial proceedings. Let's act in order to create new policies, new legislative solutions that will respond to the new reality. By using innovative technological solutions, by raising the public awareness, and by joining the efforts of all the institutions, the business community, and the civil society sector. I do believe that together we will be able to identify effective solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Elizabeta Georgievska, for your very insightful remarks and for tirelessly supporting the mission of UNFPA for the benefit of women and girls. Now let me introduce Mr. Arthur Erken to give opening remarks. Arthur, the floor is yours.
Your Excellency, the First Lady of the Republic of North Macedonia, Mrs. Georgievska, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, Dobar den, and good morning to you all, and not just those of you here in the audience, but also those that are following us in the region online. It's really a great honor for me to be here in North Macedonia and to participate in the Body Right and Bodily Autonomy high-level event. This is actually the first in a series of events in the Balkan countries and territories aimed at addressing the increasing cases and forms of online violence under UNFPA's global initiative called Body Right, and that's why the pin with the B. Before I move on, let me first say that gender equality in general and the elimination of gender-based violence in particular is at the heart of the mandate of UNFPA, which is that it is essential to the full access to sexual and reproductive health and rights, and really a precondition for the fulfillment of all sustainable development goals. It's also, as you know, enshrined in our international human rights frameworks, such as, of course, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, also known as CEDAW, amongst many others. Gender-based violence and violence against women and girls is a widespread violation of human rights and bodily autonomy. It is also increasingly a pressing global public health issue, and actually it becomes a pandemic in its own right. And of course that should worry us mightily. Gender equality and bodily autonomy, and more precisely the ability to be in control over our own bodies and to make decisions about our lives and to have choices, are fundamental. It is the foundation for achieving a more equal, peaceful, more integrated, and ultimately a more vibrant and thriving society. And it is the cornerstone for having sexual and reproductive health and rights. Sadly, all around the world, online and offline, women and girls are not in control over their bodies and their lives. Somewhere today, at this very moment, a girl is being harassed online. Somewhere today, at this very moment, a photo of a young woman is being shared in cyberspace without her consent. Somewhere today, at this very moment, a woman is being abused online, causing her psychological, emotional, and physical distress. Online violence against women is widespread and devastating. Over half of women have experienced video and image-based abuse and even more have suffered from what's called astroturfing, where damaging content, including images, is shared concurrently across platforms. Globally, as we heard from the First Lady, 85% of women have reported witnessing online violence. Just imagine that. 85% of women have witnessed that in their lives already. And nearly 40% have experienced it personally. It's just staggering. 40% have experienced it personally. And that problem is growing every single day. Let's be very clear. Digital violence is violence. Plain and simple. It has a real impact in the lives and well-being of millions of women and girls in this region, as well as everywhere else in the world. Social media platforms have become crime scenes. Women and girls, minorities, and marginalized populations are most vulnerable to having their images abused online and subjected to abuse. This rising tide of hate and violence is devastating for those who experience it, yet it is still not sufficiently addressed by the companies that own and control the platforms and by policymakers who might place greater value and protect on their interest than the rights and well-being of the people being directly affected by the violence facilitated by these technologies. Yes, tremendous efforts have been undertaken to improve, align, and adopt legislation to protect women from all forms of violence. However, there is still a huge gap in understanding, regulating, controlling, and finally, eradicating the violence women and girls are victims of in the virtual platforms and spaces. There's an ever-expanding plethora of tools, venues, and approaches used to victimize women, and we need to look at them and make decision makers, and most importantly, the perpetrators, accountable for their actions or inactions in the case of decision makers and the violence that happens in these spaces. Laws in this area have not kept pace with the technology, and they need to catch up fast. Body Right is a social movement created by UNFPA to hold technology companies, policymakers, and other leaders to account because they have the power to curb online abuse. Young people around the world are demanding real solutions and protections online. Now is the time to join in this collective effort, continue the conversations, and think about the concrete changes we need to see in our societies to ensure everybody's bodily autonomy and being safe, whether online or offline. All countries can do more to achieve gender equality and to eradicate violence against women and girls, because no country is there yet. I would like to use this opportunity to congratulate the government of North Macedonia on its outstanding leadership on gender equality and on putting into action the commitments made at the Nairobi Summit on ICPD 25 in 2019 on maternal and newborn health, and passing a new law on violence against women and domestic violence, as we heard from the First Lady. North Macedonia, for the first time I've been told, defines sexual harassment over the internet in the law on prevention and protection from violence against women and domestic violence, adopted in 2021. Efforts are continuously being made to strengthen the legislative aspect, as well as other necessary requirements for prevention and protection from online violence against women. Ladies and gentlemen, it really is my honor to welcome, of course, the speakers from the Balkan countries and territories and beyond, the distinguished guests and the friends who will discuss the current situation and the legal framework in their countries on cyber violence. These discussions on the legislative frameworks and relevant policies are crucial to address the issue of digital violence and to strengthen regional partnerships through discussing and crafting consistent and effective legal measures, as well as raising awareness to combat digital violence and gender-based violence in general. We cannot be complacent until violence against women is no more. I thank you and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Erken, for setting the tone to this very important topic. And thanks to both distinguished speakers for this insightful and rich opening so that we can continue with more, delve deeper into the discussion in the two upcoming sessions. Now, let me introduce the first session, which will focus on policy frameworks on cyber violence and the context. We're honored to host very prominent speakers from the region. And let me invite our first panel. On the panel we have Ms. Jovana Trenčevska, if you could please come and take the seat. We have Ms. Gordana Chomic, who is online with us. We have Ms. Ivanka Markovic, please. His Excellency Ambassador David Gear, please take the seat. And Ms. Rosana Dujak. Now, I would like to invite Mr. John Kennedy Mossotti to moderate this first session. Thank you. Just, do we have would you? Yes, okay.
Thank you, Aphrodita, and good morning to you all. Welcome to the first session, as you've heard, policy framework on cyber violence and context. As we discuss our policy and legal frameworks, let's keep in mind that ensuring that everyone can freely participate online without fear of violence and abuse is vital to ensuring that women can effectively exercise their rights and their bodily autonomy. We must work to ensure that the same rights that are available offline are also available and are protected online. Laws and policies should be shaped with a human rights framework and perspective, and we should be able to address the structural discrimination and inequalities that women face while protecting human rights online. And in this respect, they include the right to life free from violence, freedom of expression and access to information, and lastly, the right to privacy and data protection. As you've heard, we have a distinguished panel, and it will be my responsibility to moderate. I will be asking a question to the panelists, and they will be responding to the same. And just to quickly inform you that at the end of their presentations, we would have an opportunity to have an exchange with yourselves, and then they will come back later to provide their last information or line that they wish to add. So, we are going to begin with Ms. Trenčevska, and it's great to see you again. So the law on prevention and protection from violence against women and domestic violence adopted in 2021, which has been hailed as really seminal, especially in this region, is the first that has defined sexual harassment over the internet. And efforts, I understand, are continually being made to strengthen the legislative framework as well as other necessary requirements for the prevention and protection from online violence against women. I really want to know what is your view on this and what are some of the actions that the government can take in order to effectively combat online violence.
Thank you, Mr. John Kennedy Masuti. Distinguished Ms. Georgievska, distinguished Artur Erkel, distinguished Ambassador David John Gear, distinguished Ms. Rosana Ducek, distinguished Gordana Tomic, distinguished participants. It is my great honor and pleasure to be part of today's event, which is organized by the Office of UNFPA in Skopje. And also I would like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss such important matters, such as online violence against women and girls, and also as a government and Ministry of Labor and Social Policy to support the Body Right campaign, which is a global call to stop violence against women and girls in the virtual space. But also this is a chance to discuss what the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy, but also in general the government, is doing in order to prevent gender-based violence, including violence against women and girls online. The Ministry of Labor and Social Policy, along with the other stakeholders in the society, has been making serious efforts to create policy, but also take action towards prevention and protection of women and girls from gender-based violence, including online violence, as well as their sexual and reproductive health, promoting the rights of women and girls, of the families and communities. The government of the Republic of North Macedonia is committed to zero tolerance to all forms of violence against women by taking specific measures and activities in one of the priority areas, and that is gender equality. This commitment of the government was also verified at the summit in Nairobi held in 2019. About the existence of gender-based violence against women, which might take various forms, and which is also a phenomenon that exists in the most developed countries. Somewhere it is very obvious, somewhere it is covered. However, we should not remain silent about this, and we should not ignore it. On the contrary, we need to raise awareness how to recognize this type of violence, and we should be more intensively working on the action taken by the institutions that need to take a coordinated approach when it comes to tackling this phenomenon in the country. In order to establish gender equality in a society, first of all, we need to eliminate gender-based violence. And once we eliminate gender-based violence, we would open up big opportunities to build a society where gender equality will provide for normal functioning of the society. Unfortunately, nowadays, with the development of technology, and there is such a big spread of information, we're witnesses of abuse of internet and all the digital communication tools, which is especially used for violence against women, sexism, hate speech, or abusing various photos and videos. Unfortunately, we see on social media in our country how prominent is hate speech against women and girls. Women and girls are target of abuse, and their photos and videos are exposed without their consent. That is why our common obligation is to fight such violation of human rights of women. Republic of North Macedonia has been among the first countries that signed the Convention on the Prevention and Fighting Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, that is the Istanbul Convention, and the Parliament ratified in 2017 and also adopted the law on ratification of this convention. This convention came into force on the 1st of July 2018, and in 2021, our country adopted a law on prevention and protection from violence against women and domestic violence, and this was the first activity taken to implement the Istanbul Convention. The law is fully harmonized with the provisions of the Convention and aims to expand the prevention system, but also to ensure protection against all forms of gender-based and domestic violence. In Article 4 of this law, there are definitions, and there is also a definition about sexual online harassment. The ministry has been also committed on improving the system of prevention of gender-based violence against women and girls, as well as domestic violence. In the past period, through an inclusive and transparent process, we prepared 5 bylaws dealing with immediate and extraordinary measures, and we are also intensively working on 3 other bylaws, and this will ensure a comprehensive approach and coordinated multidisciplinary response, but also a system for building the capacities of the professionals in the system. These bylaws are of utmost importance in order to be able to talk about successful implementation of the law on prevention and protection of women against violence and domestic violence. We also drafted the first report on the implementation of the Istanbul Convention, and this report has been submitted to the monitoring body Grevio, and we expect to receive their recommendations in order how to further improve our response and prevent gender-based violence. Dear participants, violence against women and domestic violence is no longer a private matter, and the state, through comprehensive integrated policies, is putting efforts to protect and prevent the survivors of violence. In this context, we have established 13 specialized services, that is, shelters for women survivors of domestic and gender-based violence, which are distributed in the 6 planning regions. Most of them, that is 8, have been established by the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy. The other are established with the support of the ministry, the local self-government, as well as the civil society organizations. In the fight against violence, it is very important to adopt a coordinated approach and also to include both national and local institutions, as well as the local government sector, because only together, with joint forces, we can show resistance to violence and we can find ways how to tackle it. Those services include series of measures for protection, supporting the rights of the victims, but also the well-being of all women and girls, survivors of gender-based violence, as well as providing them with safe counseling, accommodation, information about their rights. All these services, which are established, actually provide protection from repetition of this violence, but also changing the perception about violence. The centers also provide accommodation for survivors who are in acute condition, when there is also real threat to their life and health, and they can stay there from 24 to 72 hours. In addition, the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy also established specialized counseling offices on the territory of the Republic of North Macedonia in 6 planning regions. We also have 10 counseling offices for victims of domestic violence and 8 specialized counseling offices for psychosocial treatment of perpetrators of domestic violence. Ministry of Labor and Social Policy, through the Centers for Social Work, also takes care of victims of any form of violence and domestic violence in order to ensure that they have access to any assistance and protection. The management of the professionals from the Centers for Social Work means efficient case management in order to enable the victims to get quality services. I would like to point out that our country also made a step forward and adopted the law on termination of pregnancy, which means that women can independently decide about their body. We are also committed to the fact that the woman should take her own decisions in her life, including the decision whether she will be actually giving birth to children and having a family. With or without a partner, the woman knows what's best for her health, and only she can take a decision for her well-being. The Ministry of Labor and Social Policy will continue its efforts to improve gender equality. So in this context, we are now working on drafting a new law on gender equality, which will further improve the status of women in all areas of society. We will also strengthen the mechanisms for gender equality, both at national and local level. And also, we will strengthen the gender mainstreaming in all areas of the society. The ministry will continue the implementation of its commitments in promoting human rights, fight against any forms of violence, and all this will be done with support and joint commitment of all relevant stakeholders in the country, also international organizations, local government units, and civil society organizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tranchevska. I think it's very clear that efforts are being made to promote bodily autonomy and indeed proactively engaged in that, and thank you so much. Our next speaker is Ms. Gordana Chomic. She's supposed to be joining us online, I believe, from Belgrade. Please, could you connect? Yes, I can see you there. And it's great to see you again. The question that goes to you is, we have to tackle online violence. And in this case, we therefore need to make efforts in several areas. Legislation, strengthen that. Increase awareness of all forms of online violence and its impact. Mobilize the media and sensitize tech and digital companies to address this issue. I would like to request you, if you could share with us what the situation is in your context and how you believe legislation is going to address this. Please.
Thank you. The best possible answer on the question is legislation framework sufficient enough? Does society and institutions combat gender-based violence online? Is from targeted persons, from girls and women who are on the internet and should answer, do you feel safe? And until they say, no, I don't feel safe, it means that it's not sufficient. And a lot of us who are fighting to have this new tool for gender-based violence controlled and any kind of violence to be made socially unacceptable, I think that's the first voice that we want to hear. That is the answer of those who are feeling violence and not feeling protected. For Serbia, we started back in 2010, 2011 to thematize the issue, and the latest 4+ years to adopt a legal framework that would cover all possible threats that appears online. And now we are in the phase of the implementation with expected ex post analysis. How does it work? Does it work at all? What doesn't work? For the report for 2022 about gender-based violence as a whole, and especially online gender-based violence. The most important gaps from our point of view, but also from feedback that we can clearly read whenever anything from the legal framework is implemented, is that blurry space in which arguments about freedom of speech appears to help to normalize hate speech, to help smear campaigns, to help popular voices about tradition and all misogyn remarks about women deserving the online violence because they ask for it style. It is transferred from reality to online and is used as an argument and comment whenever you want to have a debate in society of, does it work? Everything what we have in legal framework, does it work? From our point of view, and I was an MP for quite a period of time, now in the government, trying to defend human and minority rights and open the space for social dialogue. Whenever you deal with issue like this, you will always have quite a number of people who will say whatever you say should be a legal framework, it's too much too soon. And a lot of us who will always say it's not enough and always a little late. But the one sentence that there is always be present when you try to introduce a debate on what can we do more to combat online gender-based violence will be, it's not the time. It's never the time for anything what should be decreasing the amount of violence towards women in society. But nevertheless, we think that in Serbia, a lot done with every possible framework that we got as a recipe from European Union or made on our own. So a lot done, a lot to do, and a lot to lose if we stop fighting. What was our problem with that argument, do you deal with freedom of speech, is our proposal to make exceptions. So you say, we will have harsh punishments except for example, politicians, or you pick it, or whoever, for smear campaign and the language that I personally call verbal garbage that is used instead of communications. Maybe it would be easier to have it the tough punishments for those who love online violence, with the exceptions. Okay, you can do with politicians whatever you want. The next steps will be those necessary for any anti-discrimination regulation, explaining that articles given in legal framework cannot and will not erase people's will to hate and discriminate. There is no article in the world, there is no law in the world that will erase people being biased, be prejudiced from their state of mind. So no article will erase that will to hate and discriminate, and will not erase prejudices, and most certainly will not make people say to themselves, oh, I should not do that. It's not the proper thing to do. I should not address girls and women on the internet on the way I choose to address them. But we want to ban the behavior based on those prejudice, and we want to those new amendments on the existing framework will dispute the free choice of hate and violence, and with cases prosecuted and punished will support the process of making it socially unacceptable. Just a digression. There were several cases in Serbia when women addressed the public saying, I was the victim. It was my professor. I was the victim. It was my executive. I was the victim, not in family, but somewhere in public space. And the volcano of pro and contra, and again, actually, those volcano wordings contra her will to address the public with her own private history is again verbal violence or violence, gender-based violence. So we will have to address that very carefully, and I repeat again, we think that some kind of regulations with exceptions could work. The awareness-raising campaign with a national-wide character, with a focus on a youth and early on education, needs to be regularly introduced. That is something what Ministry of Education is really doing, and is a commitment in Serbia. And the campaign would target the rights to personal freedoms and dignity, but also the rights of others, because we think that any future campaign or work together in the region on the legislative framework with new amendments or something that would be very efficient, it will not work if we do not understand that online gender-based violence is just a matter of a tool. It's not a new phenomenon. I mean, if you say, it sounds like there were no any kind of violence before the internet appeared. No, it's just a new tool, and the expectations that just because it's a new technology, it will be safe from violence, well known for women, to women for millennials, is a pretty naive and superficial. Virtual space is the space of communication for 21st century, and whatever happens in reality will repeat itself in virtual communication, and there is no reason to expect anything else from our point of view. If there was a COVID-19 pandemic that actually brought the awareness of people about virtual life, then there is a kind of something wrong in perception of people using virtual space for decades. The point I want to make is let's be creative and use regional campaign or regional network or regional suggestion about how to amend legal framework in each of our countries. Let's use it to address the violence against women as a whole, because it's in the fabric of society, and just changing the tools. We are, a lot of us here, are granddaughters of the witches they couldn't manage to catch and burn down. So our grandmothers left us the metaphor of witchcraft, and it is still alive and kicking. So, for example, the term we use, it's a revenge porn. It indicates, explicit pornography, but it should not be just, pornography. It just be something what, at the moment of my life, I have as a intimate memento for me, for him, for her, for whoever, and then it is misused. So, with such and similar abuse on the internet should take in spectrum all forms of jeopardizing the rights to privacy, protection of personal data, and dignity. For example, it may come in a form of naming and shaming without having sexual images displayed, but targeted and maliciously received by any girl or woman. It all comes as a hate of speech and violation of human rights, basically. A particular focus should be placed on protection of children and youth, teenage and adolescents, whereas I believe an awareness campaign and education from preschool age to be crucial. It is taken into account that in the plan for strategy of human rights that Serbia is planning to adopt until the end of this 2022, in the part of human rights culture to be developed in various ways, one of them being the ongoing social dialogue. So we have a kind of a serial of social dialogue of why are you choosing hate? Why are you choosing to be violent physically in reality or verbally on internet? Why are you communicated by violence? It's a free choice. Violence is real. Violence is not private, and it's a free choice. You don't have to be violent to some person. You choose to be so because a lot of things that should be debated through this dialogue. This campaign should target public officials and servants, a wider population for everyone to be able to react adequately. So this is something what is happening when a woman steps out and say, this is my personal history, this is what happened to me, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's sexual harassment on her job, whether it's sexual harassment and violence on internet, on reality. You have a pool, you have people gathering around a good cause, and you have those who are trying to push her down and try to forbid her to step, or the next one to step and say the truth about her personal history. And our idea was, if 100 years ago we were on the streets with our bodies showing that we want our freedom to vote for whoever we want, that we want our rights to go to school, to be employed, to have a bank account, to travel around on our own, to marry or not to marry, to have kids. So we were in the streets because there were no one institutions to follow. We were making allies in institutions to talk to us. Now there is internet. So the part of that is something what UN is already doing. I'm following it very closely. So if perpetrators are there, then we who say kindly, that's not proper thing to behave on internet, should also be there. My personal history is that something what my grandmother taught me is be kind to unkind people. They need the kindness the most because they were never been a target of being kind. So defining the one general definition of online violations of the right to freedom of speech against gender-based violence. I think that's something what we should have UN here in the region as a first friend, and then to address European Union because they still don't have that clear definition. And there is always that dilemma of are we harming freedom of speech? Hate speech is not freedom of speech. That is from me, that is quite clear. So it should be wiser to build upon a practice and regular expert meetings and increasing thematic dialogues to build on the practice based on real cases and eventually come up with a legal standard on what is considered to be online violence against women, but basically against all individuals or groups. This is what we think that internet is so convenient to use because we all are on internet. And God bless the internet. It's the most democratic thing that people ever invented, but brings all what human race have, humankind have. That's being evil, choose evil, and choose hate. So we think that based on the all ex post analysis of our legal frameworks in our respective states, holding a regular expert meetings and thematic dialogues, the regional network could be established in order to serve for exchange of expertise and experience and review of best practices with the aim to develop adequate mechanisms for making all space safe. It will take time. When you change fabric of your society, it always takes time. You can build a bridge in several years, you can build your industry in several years, but to change the fabric of society that is think it's normal to be violent against women, it will take time. But if we do together, if we show all those people that we are firmly against any kind of violence, then maybe the time will come sooner than a lot of people hope and later than we hope. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Ви благодарам, госпоѓо Чомич, за вашето обраќање со доста забелешки, но и провокативни, а зборувавте за прагматичната природа на нештото, надоврзувајќи се на она што треба да го направиме во однос на законите.
That we may be experiencing, and we need to be able to address that. And that would really help me dive into the next speaker, who's no less an expert on this issue, Ms. Ivanka Markovic. So we know the gaps. We know that we have gaps. In the legal mechanisms to be able to protect women from cyber crimes or violence online, and harassment. But could you be able to share your thoughts on the situation regarding this? And what are some of the ways that you think we could be able to act in order to overcome these gaps? Ms. Markovic, please.
Hvala na pitanju.
Thank you for your question. Before I give a short answer to this question, I would like to thank you for being able to speak on this event, because we are talking about a very important aspect, which is right to privacy enshrined through the body right principle. The speakers before me spoke about gender-based violence and the forms of gender-based violence. I would like to repeat what they said. I would like to refer to the legislative solutions in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the duties we undertook with the signing of the convention. One of these is the Convention on Cyber Crime, then the Lazzarotti Convention, which provides duties for the states to protect children against sexual exploitation on internet, and finally the Istanbul Convention, which gave us the basis for some new measures which we introduced in our legal system and which are aimed at protecting women against violence in public and private sphere, and especially in a family environment. Bosnia and Herzegovina assumed all these responsibilities. We in Bosnia and Herzegovina have a very complex criminal law system because the entities in Bosnia and Herzegovina have a certain responsibility regarding some crimes, and we have a criminal code at the level of the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. When speaking about this crime of gender violence, we can speak at the level of entities. The entities in Bosnia and Herzegovina have introduced in their criminal legislation the obligations that they assumed through the Cybercrime Convention, and also regarding the crimes, the hate speech and hate crimes. I hope I'm not too fast for the interpreters. Maybe I can slow down a little bit, okay? When it comes to sexual violence as a type of gender-based violence, we must say that the Republic of Srpska went a step forward, because in 2017 they incorporated the Istanbul Convention in their criminal code. Why am I talking about the criminal code? In order to remind us all that this is the instrument with which the state protects our basic human rights and freedoms. All other procedures, administrative, civil, and so on, provide some protection, but it's not that strong. For example, a civil procedure will provide for recompense for damages, for some damage that we incurred. When talking about the Istanbul Convention and the forms of sexual violence, I must say that we included all those forms envisaged in the Istanbul Convention in the Criminal Code of Republic of Srpska, and also in the Criminal Code of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I hope a district of Brčko will follow suit. In the Criminal Code of Republic of Srpska, we have also the crime of stalking, which can be connected with body right. I wanted to bring these issues in the context of Articles 8 and 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, where right of privacy is defined and the right to freedom of speech. To what extent do we have freedom of speech? To what extent my right to privacy limits the freedom of speech? I would make a link here with something that our professors at the School of Law taught us, that it is that the right of every person is limited by the same such right of another person. My right to freedom of speech is limited with someone's right to privacy. If somebody publishes something that is about my privacy, we have to strike a balance between, on the one hand, the right to freedom of speech, not to go too much into censorship, and on the other hand, for me to protect my privacy. In the 19th century, the right to privacy by some theoreticians was defined as a right for a person to be left alone. I personally, by virtue of living in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in the city of Banja Luka, where every traffic light, every piece of land is covered by video surveillance, I kind of lost my privacy feeling of privacy. I don't have it anymore because those who supervise those cameras, which are all over the city, can see where I am at any point in time. These systems even provide that, let's say, in some shopping malls, you can read a message that I'm writing on my phone. So there's basically no right to privacy. By virtue of living in big cities, we have, quote, unquote, accepted for this privacy of ours to be violated. On the other hand, for some intimate contents in my Facebook profile or a Facebook account, which is protected by a code, to be somehow stolen and shared with other users. The problem is even more aggravated. The number of such perpetrators is on the rise. There is constant increase in the numbers of those who violate my privacy. Let me be clear, there is a difference between, let's say, the right to privacy. I, as somebody who is a public figure, as a former politician, I was exposed to the scrutiny of public. What I could say in the public sphere could be commented upon, and I could be, let's say, subjected to even some kind of lynch. But other colleagues dealing with politics got some very bad slurs and insults on internet, which were mocking them in terms of how they looked like. And where is the criminal law there? Can it help them? When I was preparing myself for this panel, I was trying to find an answer to what we have done in that regard. I would say that we have several crimes, such as, for example, unlawful entry or intrusion into a protected computer space, which can help us enjoy protection. Also, another crime is unlawful taking of photographs and using children for pornography via internet. It's a criminal offense. The very access to those internet portals, including child pornography, are criminalized. Have we done enough? Maybe. Maybe from a legislative point of view. But when it comes to implementation of the existing tools that we have in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we are lagging behind, I think. The professionals who should help the legislation to be implemented in practice, either they don't have enough training. I'm a lawyer, I'm not an IT expert, so I didn't have enough training myself. And even those departments that exist within the MOI or in the prosecutor's office, I think they're not courageous enough to use the legal provisions on criminalization of those acts, because if a crime was committed on the internet, so by proper interpretation of the legal provisions, we could criminalize those perpetrators. I think I stayed within my time allotment, and I reserve the right to react later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Markovic, for those very insightful comments on the law. And I think one of the institutions that has been mentioned repeatedly is the European Union, and we are very lucky to have Ambassador David John Gear with us. And the question obviously that comes, and there's a lot of expectation here, is how the European Union contributes and supports, especially on these efforts to ensure that we prevent online violence and we protect women and especially girls also from this kind of violence. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, John. And special greetings to the First Lady, ministers, delegates, both in the room and online. And let me first of all start by saying how much I like the body right concept. the way in which you've managed to concentrate two ideas. One, at least as I see it, the right to bodily integrity, which is being challenged. And secondly, it contains a rebuke, and a rebuke to our societies in which copyright, the protection of intellectual property, is very well covered and protected throughout our societies, and rightly so. But still, the difference between that and bodily integrity is quite striking. And it's been very interesting to listen to the different accounts of what it means in terms of cyber bullying, violence, etc. We haven't talked about what the goals are in that, and I think they're common to all sorts of violence against women and others: to denigrate, humiliate, intimidate, isolate, disempower, strip the persons of their humanity because of their gender, because of their ethnicity, beliefs, or sexual orientation. And of course, as has been said, the digital revolution has turbocharged this, creating huge opportunities, positive opportunities, but also negative opportunities for this kind of violence to reach directly into households, directly into the rooms, directly into schools, sometimes with audiences of thousands, sometimes audiences of millions, having the potential to carry shame, humiliation, and fear into our daily lives. And when you read the cases or look at the figures, and some of the figures today that you've mentioned, John, but others have mentioned as well, you just have to ask, where is our humanity? It's truly shocking. And of course, some women, as just been said, are particularly exposed, such as women's rights defenders or journalists, bloggers, public figures, and politicians. Indeed, we saw some disgraceful examples of this when the new government was formed here in January, of ministers being attacked for reasons which were unacceptable. And of course, women who have more than one commonly targeted characteristic, for example, women of color, members of a minority religions or community, or who identify as LGBT, may be attacked more frequently. And still, we have been remarkably slow to respond to such acts on such attacks on bodily autonomy. A word about the situation in North Macedonia, which the Minister has very comprehensively covered, and then a word about the European Union. Well, of course, in terms of international treaties, it's been mentioned, the relevant legislation. Treaties are the Lanzarote Convention, dealing with sexual abuse and exploitation against children, the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, and of course the landmark Istanbul Convention, which is so fundamental. These treaties provide some protection and require states to prohibit psychological violence, stalking, and sexual harassment. And they also call for preventative measures in the educational sector and other ways to encourage private companies and media to ensure effective self-regulation of abuse. But while treaties such as the Istanbul Convention do require the perpetrators of violence should be prosecuted and sanctions as regards cyber violence, implementation of these commitments depends on the adoption of domestic legislation by signatory states. And as has been said, North Macedonia, as a signatory of the Istanbul Convention, has shown that it's committed to achieving gender equality, advancing women's rights, and preventing all forms of gender-based violence. And we welcomed the significant progress that was made in January 2021 by the adoption of a law on the prevention and protection from violence against women and domestic violence. This law introduces a system for the reintegration of victims of violence, as has been covered by the Minister, but it still needs aligning with relevant legislation, and its adoption still needs to be facilitated through the various bylaws which the Minister has mentioned that the country is working on. Another encouraging development is the government's proposal to bring the criminal code in line with the Istanbul Convention. And I take this opportunity to urge Parliament to adopt these amendments as soon as possible. But of course, it's also important to establish a meaningful, effective, and easily accessible institutional arrangements and mechanisms to enable victims to report abuse to the authorities and to obtain protection and the removal of harmful materials. And at the same time, and again the Minister has touched on this, it's important that law enforcement agencies should be trained to investigate and prosecute cyber violence more efficiently. Now, turning to your question and the European Union, first thing to say is equality and values, respect for human rights, and this does fall, in my view, I agree very much, this is an Article 8 issue under the European Convention of Human Rights, are fundamental values on which the European Union itself is based. And that informs many of its activities and its work. And so our support for efforts to combat this kind of violence takes different forms. First of all, support to civil society and to our activists and other actors in order to improve, to combat this kind of violence, and also improve public awareness of the threats that are concerned in it as well. We are also, of course, following closely developments in the countries, not least in countries which are in the process of accession to the European Union. And that's why in our regular country reports, including on North Macedonia, but the other countries in the region too, we have followed very closely and commented on positive and negative steps in this regard. And that's why we welcomed the steps that were taken back in last January. It's true that there is not complete consensus on the Istanbul Convention, and I think there is more work and more discussion to be had on that. The European Parliament itself is very active in pursuing public debate on this issue. So there is more work for the European Union to do in that regard, as for all of us. But I would say that the European Union is very committed to opposing and preventing violence against women in all its forms. This is a central plank of what we do, and we'll continue to not only be an advocate for those issues, but also to support other advocates as they take this forward. So once again, I would like to congratulate you on this important campaign. It's an important initiative. I'd like to congratulate what the government has done today here so far, but also say that this is a work of many hands. It's not just governments, it's also obviously civil society, media, businesses, and ordinary citizens, because the change ultimately needs to be one of an attitude change, which would truly lead to the results that we want to see, which is a violence-free world. Thank you again.
Very well put, Ambassador. Discussion and reminding us on our responsibilities, especially when it comes to human rights law, and ensuring that values relating to equality are well maintained. Thank you very much. Last but not least is Ms. Rozana Dujak. And you coming in from the UN perspective, and would like you to shed some light on the joint and integrated United Nations response and the kind of collaborations perhaps with not just the government, as Ambassador David said, but also with the other stakeholders as well, and to ensure that we prevent and we respond to violence against women and girls. Ms. Dujak, please.
Thank you, John. I think that gender-based violence is clearly one of the top priorities for the UN family, and we've really invested a lot to tackle the issue in the past few years. It's been done on several levels, from support to introducing and implementing the latest policies that are intended to help in the fight against gender-based violence, to assisting and to create support mechanisms for victims of gender-based violence. We're also intensively working on advocating and mobilizing support jointly to combat the issue, together with partners and the government and the international community and civil society. This is something that we can achieve only if we all act together. And just to say, some of the colleagues have spoken today a lot about having the right legislation in place and also implementing the legislation. But the final part to really make a system work is our behaviors. And all of us need to ensure that our behaviors are really our norms, our practices, policies, attitudes, and beliefs, that we're really focusing on actions that will change behaviors. We need to instill the zero tolerance policy towards gender-based violence in any segment of our lives, starting with the most obvious. We need to make sure that the education system is prepared and equipped to introduce a zero tolerance policy towards any form of violence against children and youth. We need to ensure that this zero tolerance policy is implemented in any work environment, cultural setting, school, and online space. And we also need a safe social environment in which every case will be reported and treated with proper support, not only by the relevant institutions, but by the communities as well, never allowing the situation of the victims of violence to be further exacerbated by stigmatization and abuse by the community. And most importantly, we need everyone to join in, from schools to factories to religious organizations and parents' associations. Everyone needs to be involved. And only if we all act together can we stop violence against women and girls. And as I said, for the UN family, this is one of our top priorities in the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosanna. Thank you for your brevity as well. That's really good. We have very few minutes for questions. Please, if you have a question, be very specific. And then I will come to the panel. You'll only have 1 minute to be able to conclude, I mean, unless you're answering a question. May I open the floor if there are specific questions from the floor, please? And if a mic can be available for those who may want to ask a question. It's okay if we don't have a question because they were pretty comprehensive in some of the remarks that were made. Oh, yes, I see one hand.
Greetings to everyone. Greetings to the organizers. I am an activist from a National Council of Gender Equality and the SOS line for victims of domestic violence. And I initiated the opening of the first such helpline in our country. My question, or perhaps comment, all of the panelists made the point, and this is quite important, the importance of legislation, legal norms, and compliance with those norms. But what I would like to point out to the organizers of this gathering is that the campaign should go all the way to all of us women. The message should also reach us women. We should know our rights, where we can report, how we can protect ourselves, who we can turn to, because if we had hardly any legislation in earlier times, now today the minister listed all of the pieces of legislation and regulations that we have. However, continued efforts at prevention and protection of women against abuse, especially on the internet, which even children know how to use. We need to make sure that all women are aware of this, know this, regardless of where they come from, regardless of their background, social background, ethnic affiliation. So we all need to know how to protect ourselves using the various laws and regulations. So that would be my message to the organizers and all of us here and throughout the region. We must have women be aware.
Thank you so much for that useful comment. And of course, they would have their comment when they are responding. Is there any other question, please? And please, if you do not mind, don't make a comment, just go straight to the question, I think, because we are actually running out of time, the panelists to be leaving.
Good day to everyone. I got the instruction that I'm supposed to stand up, and I hope you don't mind. Stojanka Mircea, I come from the Faculty of Security. With my due respect to this forum and for the organizers of this forum, and also the importance, thank you for the importance of this regional event. The panelists, in fact, raised some very important issues, or how we should be thinking about tackling this phenomena. Which are the policies that would suffice and that would help us fight digital violence against women and girls? I would like to ask a question. Today we speak about digital violence, but only on the social media or on the social platforms. What about digital violence and abuse of technology? That also takes place in the private life of women, whenever they use their mobile phones, when they use various computers, devices, etc. Are we forgetting about this? Having in mind that all of us here in the region witness the digital violence on the social media. And that is my first question. And the second, speaking of freedom of choice, we heard that being violent is also free choice. I would like to paraphrase this question. All those who are survivors, all those who witness online violence against women, if this is free choice for the perpetrator, whether the survivors and the victims and the ones who actually witness digital violence, is it also their free choice to witness such type of violence?
2 questions. Perhaps we'll take one more before we can go back to the panel to give their responses. Is there one last question? Oh, one last. Dr. Gligro.
Greetings to all the panelists. This was quite an interesting discussion. I know personally the current minister and all the previous ministers, and oftentimes we say we are on the top of things in the region when it comes to the protection and the criminal laws. That is how to protect people from gender-based violence. I have a specific question. Having in mind that everything is excellent on paper, but when it comes to implementation, there are more problems. It was mentioned that there will be a coordination body about the legislative changes that will be made. I would like to ask the minister, how is this planned to be carried out in the country?
That was the last question. So because of time, we're actually eating into the next panel. I would request, and in the same order that you speak, I would request for us to provide any response to any of the questions, but also to provide your concluding remarks. And we'll begin the same way we started with Ms. Tranchevska.
Thank you. I will start with the last and specific question about the establishment of the National Coordination Body on the implementation of the provisions of the Istanbul Convention. The body has already been established. It includes representatives of all the relevant institutions, as well as representatives from the parliament and the civil society organizations. And the purpose of this body is to monitor the implementation of the Istanbul Convention, that is, of all the obligations that our country has undertaken to successfully tackle the violence against women and domestic violence. And once a year, this body files a public report, which can be found on the website of the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy. That is, at the end of the at the beginning of the next year, you will be able to find this report in terms of the overall work of this body. And And the main competence of this body is to give proposals on legislative changes or to provide some specific proposals, so suggestions for successful implementation of the overall legislative framework and some of the strategic documents of the government. With regard to the other questions, especially question of Professor Mirczewska, speaking of prevention from violence online, especially digital violence against women and girls, and all the available technologies nowadays, and also including abuse of privacy when using mobile phones and all other new devices or gadgets. I can speak as a minister, but also as a person who has been working for years in this particular area. And let me point out that we definitely have excellent strategic documents and legislation. However, we need to be more focused on their implementation. No worth of having excellent laws unless they're implemented and unless we manage to protect victims of violence, especially victims of digital violence. And definitely, we have witnessed hate speech against women in politics. If we cannot prevent this as a government, as a society, so that there is no longer hate speech against women on the social media, especially women involved in politics or women who are public figures, this means that we are discouraging the other women to take any public function. That is why we have, in the last several cases of such violence, as a coordinator of the national body, not as a minister, as a coordinator of the national body, but also as a human being involved in this area. 2 weeks ago, I filed criminal charges at the Ministry of Interior so that they can investigate all the allegations. So, in my view, it is high time that concrete action is taken. Someone must be punished. So this can serve as an example for the others, in order to say that we as a society and all the institutions respond to any hate speech, hate crime, violence, falsifying videos, pictures of women and girls.
Very much, Ms. Trączewska. Ms. Chomich, you're still with us online. Please, 1 minute, if we can.
Thank you. 3 takeaways from the panelists and from audience. The first one is about can we change our behavior? The pandemic that we are still practically in actually changed our behavior. We started to wear the bloody masks, to wash our hands. Unfortunately, nobody ordered us to brush our teeth and change our underwear on a daily basis. That would also be good. So changing behavior, if there is a threat and there is a niche, someone's taking care of us, is possible. And I think that model of behavior we could use as a model for campaigning together in the region with UN and hopefully European Union of how to change our behavior that is normal to be violent, to have hate speech, and to address women or any kind of minorities on internet in violent way. The second one is about, is violence free choice? Yes, it is. Hate is free choice, of course. And there is a paradox of us human creatures. The evil, the hate is spontaneous. It amuses people, and the kindness must be learned. And what I think the state should do is to create a space of kindness for the victims, for targeted persons, to have a free choice to say, I don't allow you to molest me, to harass me, to spread nasty words on internet when I am in question, and my state is behind me. The fact that people are so easy on hate and violence is the bottom line is that amuses them, and I think we should work for the space for the targeted persons, but also in changing the social fabric on why are you violent? Why do you choose to hate other people, to undermine them? There must be a reason, and I think the reason is free choice, so don't choose it. That's the change of behavior.
Thank you very much for those remarks. Then we have Ms. Marković, please. 1 minute.
Evo, pokušat ću u 1 minuti da kažem nešto pametno, jer na kraju svih ovih pametnih izjava prije mene. Pa ako govorimo o body rightu, o pravu na neku vrstu tjelesne autonomije.
When we speak about bodily autonomy, I would like to remind of the intellectual property rights. And in this context, we need to change the protection of a person's privacy. By this, I mean to protect my right and my ownership of the photographs that I posted online, so that nobody can take my video, my photograph, which are mine. So I think that we should also have the analogy how to create legislative power, how to protect this right. And I would like to say that the rule of law is not a concept that is just used like that, that is just, it means adopting a myriad of laws, but it understands implementation of the existing legislation, and that this legislation should protect people's rights.
Ambassador David Gear.
I think I would just like to inject a word of optimism, because despite how awful the situation has been and the terrible cases we've seen, I think there is a growing awareness, thanks to work such as this, campaigns such as this, good films, outreach, that there is a problem and it needs to be addressed. And I think you're also seeing governments beginning to understand that they need to address it through legislation, through specific measures, through the judicial authorities, through services. And even within the European Union, you've seen recently a readiness to tackle big tech through the Digital Services Act, where you've seen, which includes the removal of unwanted content, and so a readiness to look at how far the platforms themselves need to take action. So some cautious optimism. It feels to me like a cusp issue, an issue which is growing in strength. And I think thanks to this kind of campaign, hopefully, we will see increasingly decisive action. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. Rosanna.
I would actually say that, first of all, to thank the audience. The questions that came to me really show we're taking the dialogue to a next step, that this isn't just about, the panelists spoke quite a bit about laws and implementation, but people want to see action. People want to see behavior change. And so really to thank the organizers for promoting and stimulating this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me take this opportunity to thank the panelists for a fantastic job, and please let's give them a hand. And then we welcome the second panel. Aphrodita, please.
You go and I'll join. Yes, Jovanka is. The first session, I think, triggered a lot of thoughts, a lot of ideas and showed that there is so much work that needs to be done. Thank you very much to the distinguished panelists. And now we're moving to the second session. Break is only 1-2 minutes, and I would like to welcome the panelists of the second session, which is called How Can We Make Online Space Safer? So let me introduce the moderator of the session. She's a resource person on the topic, not only for our country, but for the whole region, Dr. Gabriela Alvarez-Minte. With her expertise in gender equality, gender mainstreaming in development and human rights and development, Gabriela is a valuable resource to our region. Bodily integrity in Latin America has been her interest long before the movement started by UNFPA, and we're happy to have Gabriela moderate the next session. Gabriela, please, the floor is yours. Thank you. Okay. You will invite? Yes.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for staying. I'm very happy to be here, and as you heard from Dita, I'm a Latin American. I will greet you in Spanish. Buenos días, buenas tardes a todos y todas. And there has been a very interesting conversation today. So what we want to do now is to take all the reflections from the last panel and think, how does this reflect in reality? And what can governments and civil society do to improve the reality of women and girls' lives affected by violence in the cyberspace? So UNFPA understands that this violence, or violence that happens in the virtual space, as acts of violence that are committed by the use of information and communication technologies or digital media against someone based on their gender. And we also know that we must also strengthen accountability of perpetrators and enforce safety and response. But what happens in reality? And what can we do to improve the response and prevent such violence? So it is my pleasure to lead this important discussion, to moderate the discussion, not to lead this, and to invite my panelists here to the floor. So I want to invite Natasha. I'm sorry, I'm going to probably butcher some of these names, but I will do my best. So, Natasha Boshkova, Besarta Brezhnika, Marian Stolkovsky, Goran Cherkes, Nita Shala, and Visare. Where is Visare? There you are. Come here. So, Visare, you take the floor first and introduce. Yeah.
Hello. Well, I invite Nita Shala as a first panelist to take the word. Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the challenges that we know is the perception that violence that happens in online is not a serious offense, and the internal biases and misconceptions that increase impunity. So I want to start with you, Nita Shala, to ask you, from your experience, how can we create awareness on online violence in policy debates and legislation to address the needs of protection and response? And before you start, Nita, I just want to alert our panelists that, of course, the first panel ate into our time, so we have a little bit of a lesser time, and we need to be more disciplined with our time. And where is Jacqueline over there? She will tell us when we have spoken for 5 minutes, so you have 2 minutes to go, and when our time is over. Thank you, Jacqueline. So you need to pay attention to her.
Okay, hi, Gabriela.
Hello.
Greetings, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today. My name is Nita Shala. I'm Deputy Minister of the Republic of Kosovo. I'm also the National Coordinator Against Domestic Violence. So we're talking about a very important, a crucial topic in terms of violence. More and more technology has confronted us to a new reality in terms also of the interrelationships between individuals. It has given a possibility to have a more inclusive society, to have the women of the voice of women in the discussion heard more. In the drafting of the policies as well, but it has also created a space in which hate can incite and can be easily applied actually in the context. With regards to the awareness raising, I think this was touched upon in the first panel. It's basically legislative changes. Of course, criminalizing it is a first step towards it. In our country, it's already criminalized. A series of forms are basically forms of violence in the internet are criminalized in the criminal code and fall within two basic chapters of the criminal code. But a second step is actually raising awareness. And awareness is raised basically from a rightful institutional response when it comes to cases, specific cases of hate in the internet. And the second one is through campaigns and through discussions like this one today, actually, to create a general, to spread information among all stakeholders as to the applicable laws and the guarantees, the rights that individuals can expect to receive from the corresponding governments. As national coordinator in my country, we've already drafted the new strategy violence, and a couple of activities actually tackle violence online, directed to women, but directed also to other individuals who might be discriminated based on age, based on perceptions, and so on, ethnicity, and so on and forth. And as national coordinator, I've also put emphasis into improving the institutional response when it comes to reported cases, be that the reported case in the police, the way how the prosecution deals with these kind of cases, the ruling from the courts, but also the services that are that could be helpful to the individual being subjected to the violence.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. And I think one of the takeaways is the deterrent effect of a right and correct and responsive institutional response. Really, really interesting. Now I move to Goran Cherkis. How can, you have a vast experience in the health system. So can you tell me, how can the health system prevent and protect victims of online abuse?
Thank you so much for inviting me, because this is one very important step in protection of human rights. This is a problem not only of the health system, but it's a multisectoral problem that we need to see from various aspects. Human rights cannot end. They actually protect the rights of all people. Sometimes we ask the question, how do we deal with people who were abused on internet, and why aren't they not reacting? Well, probably because of some social aspects. Every person has their well-being violated, health being violated, and this is how we should see violence. Our role should be proactive by strengthening the integrity of people, how to protect mental health, especially of victims, but also the perpetrators. Often we forget about the perpetrators, but they are also an important segment as well. That is really a serious task that we should undertake. Bosnia and Herzegovina has started the implementation with the Istanbul Convention, and produced more than 23 tools, especially manuals and instruction books that will instruct local communities how to use SOPs to protect and prevent violence, gender-based violence. Several gender victimization centers have been established, and they are trained how to work with victims, but also how to work with perpetrators too. This is a multi-sectoral process, and we should include the experts, but also the politics, because legislation is not produced of just one stakeholder. We need to be guided only by protection of human rights.
We really appreciate the focus on the local level and what communities can do themselves also to address these issues. Thank you so much. Now, we are going to a real case or an analysis or a reflection on what happens in online violence on the lives of women and girls. And I understand that there is a very important case in here called the public room case, where members of the public room sexually harass thousands of women and girls, sharing photos and private videos. Mr. Marian Stojkovic, you know the case very closely, so can you tell us how you have addressed online violence and what are some of the most important learnings that you can share with us about this? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Once again, I'm Marian Stojkovic, head of the Department for Computer Crime and Digital Forensics at the Ministry of Interior Affairs of the Republic of North Macedonia. Thank you for this opportunity to represent the ministry here today and present some of our activities, and also to share some of the challenges that we face in our efforts to combat online violence. You mentioned the Telegram public room case, and this was not the first case that we had acted on. Many cases, many reports from victims have come to us alleging internet violence or online violence, particularly directed at women and girls. And all those cases have been processed. Now, what is the difference between those cases and the Telegram case? The Telegram case was among the first cases where we faced a service provider, a medium, so to speak, with the law enforcement agencies, and is not based in a jurisdiction where such cooperation can be imposed. So that was the difference in this case. So just briefly, Telegram is a social medium, a social network that approximately 2 years ago stated publicly that it has a 40% increase in the number of users, followed by a corresponding increase in the stock price. And they publicly state that they do not cooperate with law enforcement agencies and that they are committed to never cooperating with law enforcement agencies in the future. In this way, Telegram became part of the dark web, and I would say that it is an example of a dark net or dark web because it guarantees anonymity and does not cooperate with law enforcement agencies. So this was the challenge that we faced in this case, in contrast to the other cases where we had good cooperation and were able to obtain data through the international cooperation mechanisms and were able to compile cases and hand them off to the prosecution offices. So what we took away from this case, first, even though there are many activities in the regional and national level for prevention, I think that prevention is something that we identified as a weakness, especially in the segment of training and in the segment of expanding awareness about risks and downsides of the internet and social networks. Minister Trenčevska mentioned that there are a number of activities aimed at prevention, and I would just like to complement her statement by adding that we, as the ministry, do not see this as a problem of the victim or as a problem of any individual institution. We see this as a problem of all society, where all institutions and all relevant stakeholders should get involved in appropriate ways in order to make sure that the efforts to combat this trend are effective and widespread. So this is something that all stakeholders in the country should join to make sure that this situation improves. Another lesson that we learned as a Ministry of Interior Affairs and myself as head of the sector, the challenge of international cooperation. We have been discussing about improving legislation, strengthening of the capacities at the national level, but oftentimes when it comes to cybercrime or computer-related crime, they are usually not possible to be treated in the national scope. Oftentimes they are not national problems, they are at least regional and usually international problems. That is why more effective international cooperation is needed. So I will now revisit the Telegram case. We had a massive problem to obtain data from Telegram because they refused to cooperate. Most of the international service providers do cooperate with law enforcement agencies, but they do so voluntarily. This means that they could share data with us that would enable us to advance in our investigation, or they could decide to withhold data from us. That is why international cooperation is so important in investigating this type of crime. Aside from the national legislation, the legislative segment, and aside from the national capacities, we also need suitable mechanisms at the international level. I would like to share a step forward made by the European Commission and the Council of Europe. Last year, the second protocol to the Budapest Convention on Computer Crime was adopted, and this year it was signed by more than 20 member states of the European Union. And this protocol concerns facilitation or acceleration of international cooperation. Until now, we used international legal aid mechanisms and item 24.7, but now we have two new articles in this additional protocol, namely Articles 6 and 7, which enable quick exchange of evidence and expanding the role of providers by directing them to cooperate with law enforcement agencies when it comes to national level offenses. So this is a good step forward in obtaining evidence more quickly and thus investigating and prosecuting internet violence cases faster.
That was really, really interesting, and I will not repeat some of the points because I think I will take them to my last points of reflection because they were super interesting. Thank you. We know that the consequences of violence against women in the cyberspace are as serious and affect the health and lives of women and girls. Their physical and sexual violence survivors report mental health issues and psychological distress. However, there's another element that is really interesting about this violence, is that online violence has negative consequences for women's political and social engagement, employment opportunities, and access to education and information. When women are are fearful of having her voices heard online because of violence, they tend to silence their voices, and that has a real consequences of women's political participation into the democratic debate in general. So I'm very glad that we have a civil society representative today here with us, Ms. Brezhnica. Women's groups are many times the closest to the victims. What have you observed, and what would your recommendations be to improve the legislations and to make online spaces safe? Thank you.
Përshëndetje për të gjithë. Unë jam Besarta Breznica.
Greeting to Besarta Breznica. I work as a project coordinator against the violence on gender base on the women in Kosovo concerning the empirical research on online are lacking. Our work in field tells us that the victim of online violence are women and girls. We are witness that women and girls are threatened in different ways through their pictures in the way so they can offer some services that men ask for them. We are witness of some form of abuse, sexual abuse, as pornography that has to do with spreading of information, of pictures, of videos without consent of the person in the picture. Considering the fact in legal issues, activities, we should consider adoption of a penal provision that has to do with Penal Code of Kosovo to fight the cybercrime. The Kosovo police also has a unit of fighting this cyber crime to answer to these issues. Also, in order to stop the violence, online violence, and to be investigated and to be reported by the people who are a victim of online violence, we should talk about this violence because it was talked also with the domestic violence also, and the reporting of this kind of violence was reported more and more. We live in a patriarchal family. Women has issues to go. Women should go at the police station, but they fear to go and tell what happened with them, that their pictures were spread in the social media. That's why we think that we should talk about this issue, about online violence, and we suggest that citizens to know more, to be familiar more with the laws, to have more campaigns, that citizens have more approach and more information about violence, online violence, and how to be more to work on them with laws, to stop them according to the laws. Yeah.
From the experience of women of an organization working with women directly. To complete this circle, I propose that we complement the view from someone who was also involved in the public room case, but also is an activist on these issues. So Natasha Boshkova, I will ask you, what are the main learning points from the case and from your experience in working in these issues that you can share with us?
Thank you, Gabriela.
The ratification of the Istanbul Convention accelerated the process of harmonizing the domestic standards for protecting women against violence. In 2018, the government adopted the action plan on the implementation of the Istanbul Convention. Among others, it included the adoption of a separate law for prevention of violence, and also to adopt around 30 other laws that would imply comprehensive institutional response towards violence against women. Unfortunately, 4 years later, only a few of these laws have been adopted. So one can admit that existing legal framework is lagging behind the rapid changes in the society, which also impact the increase in the number of cases of violence against women. So we definitely need to implement existing laws in order to respond to the realistic situation. In January 2021, the Law on Protection from Discrimination was adopted. This law definitely enhances the protection, not only about domestic violence, but also about all other forms of gender-based violence. And this law also recognizes internet as a place where violence or sexual harassment against women often takes place, and that this phenomenon must be tackled. In parallel to the adoption of this law, there are ongoing changes of the criminal code, and fortunately those changes are stuck in the parliament. We don't expect any rapid or fast incrimination of certain forms of violence, including the sexual online harassment. With the changes of the criminal code, we introduce new crimes, and a behavior that was previously not criminalized is criminalized, such as sexual harassment and stalking. But given the current developments and also the case public room and many other individual cases in which women have been exposed to sexual harassment, hate speech online, civil society organizations, especially women's organizations, request online sexual harassment to be included also in the provisions of the criminal code. Women, survivors of sexual abuse or violence, also are faced with inadequate response of the institution. This is the general impression. The institutions do not trust their reports, and they would take it as something which is relative and not certain. That is why they refrain from asking protection from the police. When it comes to the case of public room, around 7,000 members for years have been sharing videos and photographs of women and girls. When this became a visible case, the dominant narrative in the general public, but also in the institution, was that these women should be discredited, humiliated, or accused, or they should be ashamed for what is happening, and they were exposed to double victimization in all of the further actions. In fact, this case, Public Room, has proved how deeply rooted is the stigma against female sexuality. If you want to humiliate a woman, put her in a sexual scenario or talk about her in a sexual context. This way, in the first wave of reactions, in this case, women were not treated as victims, but the most common narrative about these women was, she asked for it herself. On the other hand, the way the institutions deal with such cases is very important, because this is important for the prevention of future cases. Court decisions must be frequent, well argumented, in order to prevent any other perpetrators for committing such crimes or such violence. That is why we often mention public room case, because this public room case refers to all the digital violence, whether it is hate speech, sexual harassment, etc. This shows that the lack of clear and precise legislation and also lack of knowledge and capacities in the institutions, all this has proved that our society is tolerant towards the violence against women, and it is encouraging the perpetrators. That is why we had Public Room Case 1, Case 2, and many other small groups on the social media, even localized, such as Gevgelia Hub, Strumica Hub, etc. Yet, we see some positive developments. After several years' fight, asking the institutions to respond to this case, 4 people have been convicted, that is the administrators or the organizers of this group, even though this is not enough. But still, it's a major step taken by the institutions. Another thing that is missing, even though we don't have clear legal framework, I still think that when the courts and the prosecutions are acting, there is a lack of discourse of recognizing these cases as gender-based violence, sexual violence, or as cases that make girls and women more vulnerable to this type of behavior. When this Public Room case came to public, the main argument of the courts, of the prosecution, and the others was saying that there is a lack of laws or legal provisions, and that is why we can't do more about this. I think that that the institutions could have done much more, even though some of these behaviors are not criminalized, such as spreading, encouraging hatred based on sexual orientation through a computer system, then trafficking in human beings, trafficking in children. In some cases, we have shown continuous exploitation of women and girls in the context of these organized social networks. That is why the response should have been more rapid, more efficient, and also in accordance with the principle of due diligence. We mentioned the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, Istanbul Convention, and the law since 2021 speak about paying due respect, which means that institutions should first recognize and efficiently to respond to these forms of violence. The principle of due diligence should not only be recognized in the law, but one should also recognize all the system weaknesses, lack of financial resources that must be invested in order to ensure for prevention, but also protection of victims from this type of violence. What this case of public room showed is lack of a system for adequate data collection and documenting the cases. If we have a clear picture about the scope, the prevalence, and the frequency of such cases, we would also have enough evidence that there is need for faster reaction of the institutions, that there is a need for faster changes of the legislation and norms based on the reality in the society. Being aware that this case, public room, and other similar cases, does not require only response of the national institutions. This is a transnational problem, just like the previous speakers mentioned, and that is why it should be seen like that. It's not by chance that last year a group of women's organizations and human rights organizations from the region sent a public letter to the institutions in the region that there is a need for common efforts in order to tackle the problem of violence, digital violence against women.
Can you speak a little bit slower? Because
Oh, sorry. Извинете.
The request of civil society organizations were aimed to get out of the practice of the institutions, and all those small number of cases to be processed as should not be processed as abuse of personal data, but rather should be treated as gender-based violence and should be recognized as misogyny and victims, women as victims of this type of violence.
And the key message sent by the organizations is that we cannot resolve the problem unless we name it with its proper name. And that is why we should identify it as gender-based violence against women. And the key recommendation that I would take from my experience and the experience of the victims that I have worked with is that we need a clear and comprehensive definition of gender-based violence on the internet. We need sufficient financial resources to make sure that the resources can respond appropriately by investigating and prosecuting perpetrators, as well as sufficient funds for assistance and support to victims. And of course, international cooperation for dealing with this problem, which I'm sure we all agree is transnational. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I'm going to ask how much time do we have? We have, what, 10 minutes. So I'm going to open the floor for questions. Do we have any questions from the colleagues? Yes, of course you can.
Today we spoke a lot about legislation framework, but legislation is just the basis for our activities. But it is very important to include the multisectoral dimension in this problem. The legislation must enable a multisectoral approach because the laws themselves are not going to prevent this phenomenon from taking place. And what is also very important is that we speak about women here, but we must never forget that we should also focus on adolescents, on young people where violence is so evident, high school students. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Sarajevo, there have been suicides which were connected with the photographs that were shared through mobile phones. So the consequences are devastating. We all need to remember that this also has an economic impact. We frequently ignore or neglect the economic impact of this phenomenon, not only because the victims had health problems, physical health, mental health problems, and that well-being, whenever you distort a person's well-being, the consequence is that these people cannot find employment. If they're of a younger age, then they have traumas for the rest of their lives. Sometimes we have the whole families which are isolated and stigmatized. That is why I say prevention is important, but it is also important to include all sectors. Not only sectors in the region, because in the region we know each other. I know so many people in this room. Ministry of Health of Macedonia, Sanya, Nena, people that I work with. So the whole region should not only work on technical level, but on political level as well. We expect from UNFPA, as an agency of UN, to be the leader in this story, but also for all other international agencies to follow that lead. UNICEF, for instance, and all other agencies that should continuously give our support, because our struggle is also continuous. Violence is violence. Let us not divide it into online violence and other type of violence. Violence is one single phenomenon that causes so many consequences.
And that is very, very well said. And you take from some of my last points from me. If there is yes, you have one question. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Gabriela, and respect and greetings to the panelists. It was very inspiring. I would like to ask a specific question because all of you contributed to my question. Ms. Breznica mentioned that in the region we live in traditional families, and this is true of many women, that they live with violence, they live with online violence and digital violence, and for them it is very difficult to go to a police station and report it. And hence, it is not surprising that the consequences and effects of such violence end up creating health problems. And probably they might be expected to seek some kind of relief for this problem in a different place, maybe in the healthcare sector, which is a place which will not be so stigmatizing, perhaps. And the harm or damage is a constitutive element of many criminal offenses. We are talking about criminal code, but criminal code is not something that is floating out there beyond the lives of people. Quite the contrary. Well-known German professor has said that the criminal code is a constitution for the common man. But if harm is a constitutive element of many criminal offenses, including these offenses that deeply affect the lives of women and girls, and if we accept that the consequences, the harm of violence against women are multi-layered, and if we are aware that the costs of such violence are significant, and I would like to ask Mr. Cherkes, because he mentioned the healthcare sector. Do you have any good practice or experience that you can share in this forum in terms of how the health system, how the healthcare system can recognize or has there been a approach based on recognizing violence against women? And if you have, how long has this been in existence? Thank you.
I'm going to say that since 1996, we have been building a system in Bosnia and Herzegovina that recognizes violence and trauma. It is a system that was established because we went through a war and because we had a conflict that forced us to build such a system that will recognize and work with traumas. It took a long time, more than 20 years. We have been investing in community mental health centers in which we have psychiatrists, psychologists, and other experts. So it is a multi-sectoral approach that work with victims, but also with perpetrators. For a longer period of time, we have been working on interlinking various sectors, health sector, education sector, etc. The best place where you can recognize online violence is education. When you can recognize that the child has a problem, you can easily come to the parents. Very frequently, you realize that the child's health is a result of the relationships in the family. So that is why I have been saying that the health system cannot respond to this problem by itself. Only an integrated system can be the true response to this problem. That is why it is very important to create links, relationships, to join capacities, to build capacities through education and through long-term programs. In the region, we have been victims very frequently to projects which are short-term. You can see results only with long-term projects. When you go in the field, when you build communities which are resilient to violence, communities that cherish values that have no violent elements of any kind. And this takes time. So I will say that as we changed our system, we changed our legislation. And I'm proud to say that when we speak about the Istanbul Convention, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we did so much, even more than other countries which are members of EU and which are our neighbors, only because we managed to recognize the fact that the violence against women should not be hidden. We have to be open about it. We have to act against it, and that is the only way we can achieve results.
I think they're telling me that we have run out of time, which is a shame because I wanted to give the speaker a final words, but we don't have the time to do that. But that only means that this conversation needs to continue in other spaces and in other moments. And I thank you all very, very much for being here. And let me just give you 3 takeaways from the day today. One takeaway is that violence against women and girls in the internet and in using technology is part of a continuum of violence. It doesn't exist alone. Therefore, it requires an all-society approach with all sectors involved, but very importantly, with service providers involved. And that means, my third point, it's an international and regional response. No country or territory or community can do it alone. And with that, I thank you all very much, and thank you for your patience. And I give the floor, because now it's the time for the final words, for my colleague Arthur Enken. It's your time. We will leave here and we will give you the microphone. Thank you.
Friends, partners, colleagues, guests, and panelists, really it's my duty to close this conversation. You know, as a father of two daughters, of course, this is a topic that's very close to my own heart. Because as a parent, and they are 22 and 19 now, you're constantly worried about your children, of course, but also about your daughters in particular, who are constantly on the internet. And you don't know really what they are facing. And so, you know, but as a parent, I've often been frustrated with the companies that allow this to happen and not regulate this carefully, with the schools, who sometimes, as I think Goran, you said just now, that probably can pick up on things that they should, and then they say, well, it's not my problem. So it's a very important topic for me personally, and I hope you enjoyed it. I tremendously enjoyed these two panels, because I think I learned a lot myself, and also felt the passion really from the panelists about this topic, and that it's actually long overdue. Although I also was happy to hear the ambassador from the EU saying, but let's also be a bit optimistic that we are doing something about it. There are these conversations now taking place. There are governments who are now taking action. And I think that is, of course, a very, important probably message that, we start to recognize this is an issue, and it's an issue that we need to continue to work on. And as many of you have said, this is just one form of violence. There is violence against women and girls, period. That's there. And they found a new loophole now, which is now the internet. What happened before on the streets or in the schools or whatever it was, in the workplace, now we have also the internet in which we can violate women and girls in particular. And of course it's not just women and girls, but it's particularly women and girls, which of course makes me want to say a little bit more to my fellow men, because most of the perpetrators are just people like me, us, men. And I don't think we have enough discussions among men around that issue. Why does that happen? Why do we feel the need to demean women, to put them in their place? Why are we so afraid of the opinion of women? Why are women politicians being targeted for speaking out? Why is that? Why are we so insecure that we need to feel the need to put women down? And I really do think, man, we need to have that discussion among ourselves, because the problem is really us. As I think the minister from Serbia said, violence and hate is a choice. If we say today we don't violate women anymore, it's over. It's over. If we make that decision, each and every one of us, to not do it anymore, it's over. Now, of course, I know this is wishful thinking, but I do say that this issue around men and boys and engaging them on this issue is important, because I've seen and I've worked in many countries. The moment women particularly start to get into places of public domain is when they really become the victims. And all of a sudden, as I said, men feel threatened about that. And I've seen it in many countries that I worked in that the moment that happens, violence goes up. Because all of a sudden, they're not in the homes anymore, or just in the schools. It happens, and all of a sudden, everywhere else. So one of my personal messages to us and to UNFPA is to continue to engage men on this issue. It's not just, as many have said, legislation. Legislation is one piece. Very important, absolutely very important. But if people are not ready for that legislation, it will not work. And we need to start from very little boys all the way up to they grow up. That respect of bodily integrity, respect for the opinion of girls is an important part of growing up, and not feel threatened about that. So I had this whole speech prepared, and I thought, you know what, it's another speech by another UN functionary. I just want to talk about this issue because I do feel that that's an issue I think we need to address. So when we go forward, we need to think about that and how we change societies from violent into peaceful. And this is something that I've been struggling with for a long time as a development practitioner. What turns a violent society into a peaceful society? What ticks? What changes things? And it's not an easy answer, to be honest with you. There isn't really a lot scientific evidence out there, but the one thing that we also need to work on more, it's not so much on the legislative framework, which is important, but it's also around the social policies that we have. And it's interesting how social policies impact behavior. And the one example that I can give, because I asked once in a forum on Men Engage, this was about violence against women and men engaged, I said, what happened with a peaceful society? And the answer was, we don't know a lot, but the one example that I could give was from Norway. And it always stuck with me. Norway's violence against women figures went down after the enactment of equal work, equal pay. This was quite an interesting analogy. In other words, the moment we start to pay women the same salaries we do men, all of a sudden we see a link with violence. So think about that as we go along. It's a fight we have to fight every single day. It's an epidemic in our societies. COVID has only exacerbated that epidemic in our societies because we stayed home and were on the internet and we all of a sudden saw what happens. So going forward, we have a real long, hard battle ahead of us. It's a call on all of us to keep on fighting for this issue. It's a call on men to be front and center in that fight against violence that we perpetrate particularly against our women and our girls. And I wish you all, of course, success. UNFPA will continue to be a partner in this fight because it's so at our heart of the mandate that we have. And of course, one of our 3 zeros, I don't know whether you're familiar with our 3 zeros, unmet need for family planning, 0 unmet need for family planning, 0 women dying in childbirth, and 0 gender-based violence and harmful practice against women and girls. And this is such an important part for us. So we will be with you as we go along. And I know it's a part of a series of regional conferences that we will have. And as I said, let's not be complacent until violence against women is no more. Thank you.
Well, there is not much to say after all those rich discussions, after the closing remarks of Mr. Erken, and I think we've reached the main purpose of this conference, which I stated at the beginning, is to start the conversation. So we not just started the conversation, but we put so much passion into this topic that I'm sure that after this forum we're much more energized to do something about what's happening, to stop it and to actually eradicate it as good as possible so that women and girls do not suffer anymore. So this discussion and recommendations will be taken to the next stages together with the next regional events. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first forum and there will be 3 more to follow during the year in other parts of our region. And as we finish our online streaming, I would like to invite you all for a refreshment in the restaurant, to thank you for being here today, for being online, to the panelists for so much passionately agreeing to participate, for providing their inputs, and for, again, I'm using the word passion so much, it's just because that's how I felt and I think a lot of you did. I would like to thank all my colleagues in my team here, but also colleagues from our region that have worked hard to prepare this event. And the results are obvious, and we look forward to our collaboration to continue what we have agreed today and to show in the other events to come. Thank you very much.